Okay. Dr. Kirk Curnutt is Executive Director of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and serves as Managing Editor for the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. He is Professor and Chair of English at Troy University. His office is in downtown Montgomery and looks out towards Pleasant Avenue, where Zelda Fitzgerald was raised. Curnutt is the author of the Cambridge Introduction to F. Scott Fitzgerald, among other books, and the editor of the Oxford Historical Guide to F. Scott Fitzgerald. So please welcome Dr. Curnutt.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with y'all in this strange new world that we share together. And I thought what I would do is just speak quickly tonight about this project that we've been doing. 2020 is a very important year for F. Scott Fitzgerald fans because this is the kickoff to the 100th anniversary of his career. And we were all set with about a year-long series of events that were supposed to begin last March 30th, and then really go into gear a week later, which would have been the 100th anniversary of Scott and Zelda's marriage. And of course, life got in the way, events got in the way, and so we've been quickly scrambling to change and put things on online. So I would just want to note, if any of y'all don't get your Scott and Zelda filled tonight, we have the Fitzgerald Society has been doing a series of online webinars for the past 6 months, really, and some of those we've done them on all the major books, and we have some special guests. Scott Fitzgerald's great-granddaughter joins us for one. So if you're interested, I'll be happy to let anybody have the website for those, and they are for free. I know we're all tired of PowerPoints and things, but I thought I would go ahead and share with you my PowerPoint, since it's probably going to be much more interesting to look at than I am. But I'm going to go ahead and start up here. And if for any reason that slides don't change or you don't see a new illustration, please jump in and let me know. We're still getting used to Zoom here. But again, I taught for 23 years in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm actually in Troy, Alabama, which is about 45 minutes south right now. We have a couple different campuses at Troy University. But part of the reason we put this book together, the publisher New South Books came to me about 1.5 years ago and said, you know, we'd really like to do something Scott and Zelda. And I said, it's not very well known, but he actually wrote 3 stories about Montgomery that they've been reprinted in different short story collections, but they've never been printed together as a trilogy. And it seems to me that there'd be a kind of a fun book for collectors or for tourists coming through Alabama. As we'll see in a little bit, Montgomery has kind of taken off or it had taken off as a tourist mecca. So I suggested to them that we pull these 3 stories together and call it All of the Bells. And I was very grateful that some wonderful Southern writers, including Lee Smith, was willing to blurb it for us. We have a lot of literary folks in the South who are very interested in Scott and Zelda in Montgomery. If you don't know the basic story, here's what happened. It was thanks to World War I that Scott and Zelda met. Fitzgerald was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He basically went in the Army because he was flunking out of Princeton, and they had a deal at the time that you could go into the Army as effectively as getting a withdrawal rather than flunking out. So he was in the Army from 1917 to late 1919. And he went first to Kansas, then to Kentucky, but he ended up in Alabama. And Camp Sheridan was the name of the camp. It was on the north side of Montgomery. Montgomery, although it was a state capital at the time, and it still is, but it was a fairly small provincial city of only about 40,000, and it changed completely changed the um, the sort of feel of Montgomery. It doubled the population. He was there from July of 1918 on, and he was actually sent in October up to Camp Mills up in Long Island, and his troop got on the troop ship and was prepared to head abroad when an influenza outbreak happened. And this was, of course, during the great epidemic of 1918, which a lot of people had completely forgotten until it became suddenly relevant. It was always one of his biggest regrets that he never made it to Europe, to the Western Front. And many years later, in the mid-1930s, he wrote a fabulous story called I Didn't Get Over, which I think captures the regret of a lot of young men who sort of tied their masculinity to whether they had actually seen battle or not. It's interesting. Camp Sheridan did have a couple of its own influenza outbreaks, and the minute the pandemic hit, I started getting a lot of emails from different media outlets asking whether Fitzgerald had ever written about the great epidemic of 1918. And the reality is only in his second novel, The Beautiful and the Damned, does he talk about it really at all. But he passes over it very quickly. And that's interestingly true of many of his generation. I think for them, the influenza pandemic, although it ended up killing more people than the Great War, was overshadowed by the sheer cataclysm of the war itself. So as we think about how our current pandemic may affect literature in a couple years, we might just wonder too if 20 years down the road, literature will remember this event that we've all spent 9 months living through. Zelda Fitzgerald was a native of Montgomery, Alabama. She happened to graduate high school about a month before she met Fitzgerald, and she only turned 18 right as they were meeting. So theirs was a young love. He was 22, she was 18. She was relatively well known in Montgomery as the daughter of a prominent state Supreme Court justice, but also a very audacious young lady in and of herself. Her generation was the first one that had grown up with or had entered adolescence with cars and a lot of freedoms that previous generations had not enjoyed. So she was quite the firecracker, as they say. One of the interesting things that has come about only in about the last 7 years is it's not widely known, or wasn't up until 2013, that she actually wrote before she met Fitzgerald. That, if you know the story, that was a big bone of contention in their marriage. But a few years ago, we were getting ready to host an event for scholars here in Montgomery, and a local indie bookstore owner at the time pulled me in his back room and showed me a yearbook from his grandfather from 1918, and he flipped through it, and lo and behold, there was a short story by Zelda Sayre called The Iceberg, and to my knowledge, nobody had ever heard of it. I ran home and looked in all the books and thought, lo and behold, we've discovered something here. And so we printed a little edition for folks at the conference, and it so happened that their granddaughters were in attendance, and 2 weeks later it was in the New Yorker. So it was kind of, I like to think that I was that was my one shot of fame, is that we were sort of in the ground floor there of getting some of her early writing out. As I mentioned, Montgomery was a very small southern capital at the time. And just to give you an idea, more than 40,000 soldiers came into the city, and that doubled the population. So this is just our images of what the small city into itself, of what Camp Sheridan would have looked like. This is a image from his ledger. He kept a diary throughout most of his life, and it is available online at the University of South Carolina. It's kind of fun to go through. But if you can read the first line there above where, or next to where it says September, it says fell in love on the 7th of September. A little later it says Zelda Sayre, but that's generally considered the first acknowledgement of their relationship in early September, shortly after Labor Day of that year. And interestingly enough, every once in a while we go up to the archives and dig around in their collection of materials from Camp Sheridan, and we found this postcard there, which kind of looks like it should be Scott and Zelda, but it was published before their time. So I always like to tell people they kind of grew into their roles as being the icons of the era. So much of the imagery did not so much was not so much based on them, but they sort of based themselves on the imagery that was around at the time. This is a picture of what Zelda's house looked like shortly before it was torn down in the mid-1970s. It's on an area that we'll come back to a little later on called Pleasant Avenue in an old neighborhood called Cottage Hill. It's important because it is a central setting in all three of the short stories that are in this volume. And this is a colorized photo of her next to the house in her mother's bed of roses, getting ready to go to a dance in that summer of 1918. This porch, this house, figures into not only these three stories, but into all of Fitzgerald's writing about young soldiers falling in love with young women. So if you've ever read The Great Gatsby and you read those scenes about Jay Gatsby wooing Daisy Fay on her porch and in the sitting room of her house, this would be something akin to what would have been in his imagination. Again, it would have looked a lot different 50 years before this photo was taken. There are only 2 houses in the world that the Fitzgeralds ever stayed at that are around and even semi-open to the public. Up in St. Paul, there is one of the houses that he grew up in, one of the apartments that he grew up in. But in Montgomery, we have the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum, which was opened in 1987. I volunteered there for about 25 years and supported immensely. It's a great operation, like a lot of author homes. It's a mom and pop operation and it struggles to stay in business. Probably the greatest thing that they did was for many years when I was there, they rented out the 2 top floors to tenants who would live there. And that never really worked out. So about 2 years ago, they turned these rooms into an Airbnb. And all of a sudden, that got the Fitzgerald Museum into the New York Times after 30 years of never really being able to get much national publicity. I should note that a lot of these author homes are struggling right now because of the pandemic. Just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've seen the Steinbeck House has closed down out in Salinas, and the Hemingway Childhood Home up in Oak Park, Illinois. So the pandemic has wreaked a lot of havoc on these small mom and pop operations. This is a picture of Zelda from many years after their romance. This would have been taken in late 1931, early 1932. It is one of the most famous photos of her because it was used as the publicity photo for her only novel, Save Me the Waltz, which came out in 1932. What I like to do when I was a volunteer at the Fitzgerald Museum is I would bring folks into the room and say, look at the floor under your feet and now look at the floor in this photo. And you know, people would get a neat little shot of recognition there. One thing I would note as well is this photo was taken only a few months after she was released from a sanitarium, where she had spent about 15 months in Switzerland. So she looks relatively healthy here. But if you look even back earlier in July 1931, you could tell that she had been really, really ill just months earlier. This is another image from this, and you can see part of the reason that these photos are so famous is that they were on the cover of a paperback, the biography of Zelda, that is this year celebrating its 50th anniversary by Nancy Milford. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s, all of my mother's friends had copies of this book. And then when I went to college in the 80s, all the young girls who were of a literary bent had their mother's copies with them at college. So it's always been a kind of neat totem to me that to be able to say that Montgomery's connection to literary fame is on the cover of this book, and you can even see on the artist rendering there they wrote down Montgomery, Alabama on there. One of the things we did a few years ago when we had our a big Fitzgerald celebration in Montgomery was I got an artist friend of mine to blow that photo up, and we put it on cardboard. So now when folks, if you ever come through Montgomery, we'd love to have you. Whenever they come to the museum now, you can actually get your picture taken with Zelda. And I will say that that cardboard cutout has drawn a bigger crowd than I ever did when I used to give talks there. So that probably says something about my my personality or my entertainment value. I should mention as well that these three stories, although they represent the core, really the gist of what Fitzgerald wrote about Montgomery, it's not the only place Montgomery pops up. In Great Gatsby, he transposes a lot of his experience up to Louisville. There's a travelogue that he wrote that was published in 1924 called The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. That's a lot of fun because they were living in Westport, Connecticut in mid-1920, the summer of 1920. And Zelda got up one day when it was homesick, so they jumped in the car and they raced off to Montgomery, a trip of about 1,500 miles. And he wrote a pretty funny article about their struggles on the road. This is long before the interstate system, so cross-country drive was a bit more of a hassle. In the photo there, the house that's in the background, that is the house they lived in Westport, Connecticut. And a couple friends of mine just put out a documentary you may have heard of called Gatsby in Connecticut. If you haven't seen it, I really encourage you. It's on Amazon Prime and it's on YouTube. It's only a couple bucks. It's a great, fun movie about their time that summer. And they propose that part of Great Gatsby is actually based on events in Westport, as opposed to across the Long Island Sound over on Long Island. This is a picture of when they finally, it took them about 3 years to sell that article. So when they published it, they came back and they posed for photos and gives you an idea of, it's a pretty silly article, but it's an interesting piece to get an idea of what auto travel would have been like in 1920. One of the casualties of the pandemic was we had sort of planned to recreate this trip in July and to follow the route as best we could on what we would now call blue highways of America. And it just wasn't feasible to do, unfortunately, out of an abundance of safety precaution. The first story that is in this collection is the earliest, and it's called The Ice Palace. It's a series of stories that Fitzgerald sold to the Saturday Evening Post that he cranked out in a pretty astonishing burst of inspiration in late 1919 to early 1920. His first novel was accepted in September 1919, and that was really what allowed Zelda to feel comfortable to say, okay, we can go ahead and get married now. So both his marriage and his literary career are tied together. I mentioned that the novel came out on March 30th, I believe it was, and a week later they were married. So those two events are really tied in his mind. The Ice Palace is a story about a Southern belle who's very much a Zelda character. And she is being courted by a Yankee who she meets in Asheville, but he comes down to Tarleton. And one of the interesting things about this story is he did not call Montgomery Montgomery. He called it Tarleton, and he moved it across the state line into southern Georgia, probably so not to offend his in-laws or Zelda's friends, who were numerous in the town and didn't necessarily like him. Their name for him was F. Scotch Fitzgerald, so you can get a sense of their feelings toward him. But it's a fish out of water story. The belle, whose name is Sally Carol Happer, ends up going on up to Minnesota to meet her beau's family, and she experiences winter for the first time. And it's a series of a series of escalating catastrophes. She gets lost in this giant castle of ice that they build up in Minnesota. What's interesting for me and for a lot of folks in Montgomery is this illustration that's on page 2 of it. And here's a clearer copy of it. Part of the story that takes place in Tarleton is set in a cemetery that still exists today and is one of our major tourist attractions down here. It's called Oakwood Cemetery. And by and large, it still looks like that illustration. The illustrator from the Saturday Evening Post never saw a picture of it or anything. It was just Fitzgerald's vivid description brought it up in mind. Oakwood is actually older than Montgomery, and it too is suffering in the pandemic. We've had to send volunteers. I say we, residents have had to go in as volunteers and sort of take on some of the upkeep that the city can't afford to do right now. But this is a shot of the actual cemetery, and there's a scene as they stroll the cemetery where they talk about the meaning of the South, which is very controversial right now because all three of these stories do partake of the sort of the myth of the lost cause. I would not say they are pro-Confederate stories. They certainly don't celebrate the South of Civil War, but they do partake of the sense that something was lost when the South lost the Civil War. And to that regard, it is it can be a difficult story to talk about, but there is a slope of unknown Confederate soldiers. And in the story, it's a very audacious move on his part because he has these two lovers strolling through the cemetery, and Sally Carol Happer goes on this whole soliloquy about what it means to be a Southerner, and you'll just never understand being a Northern boy. And at the end of the story, they make out in this cemetery. It's a pretty audacious kiss for 1920 in a popular magazine like the Saturday Evening Post. Oakwood Cemetery today is probably more famous for hosting the grave of Hank Williams. And Zelda's parents are buried not too far from this part of the cemetery as well. Unfortunately, I've never really liked this tradition, but when people usually go visit Hank's grave, they leave beer bottles on his grave. So when I went out and took this picture, I kind of moved them off. Oakwood has a lot of history to it, and it's a very interesting cemetery to explore. The second story that's in the collection is called The Jelly Bean, and it is not published in the Saturday Evening Post. It was published in a magazine that would fold only a few years later called Metropolitan Magazine. It's fascinating to me because there were, the Saturday Evening Post was the biggest magazine of the day. It had about 3 million subscribers. And it was very much, if you knew Life magazine in maybe in the 50s or 60s, or if you maybe read general interest magazines all the way up through the 80s or 90s, that was really the niche that the Saturday Evening Post fit. It was a general entertainment magazine. In that regard, it was fairly conservative. Metropolitan Magazine catered to an audience that would be more akin to folks that would read maybe Vanity Fair or The Gothamist today, much more people that, much younger audience, first of all, but also an audience that wanted to sort of fancy itself being a little more urban, a little more sophisticated, a little more cosmopolitan. So Fitzgerald really, this is a place where he did not necessarily publish stories about New York City in the Metropolitan Magazine, but he was writing about Minnesota and Montgomery in there. But what he would do is he would show that this younger generation was very adult in its tastes and its pleasures. And you can see there that the young man is handing off a flask to a young woman. This is in the middle of Prohibition now. Prohibition has just started only a few months before this magazine comes out. So to have a story in this magazine, it was probably a story that the Post would have toned down quite a bit because it does involve drinking and gambling. And to have young American women involved in such naughty escapades would not have necessarily flown well. In the Metropolitan, it was okay because they were selling young audiences the idea that what their experiences were going to be more unvarnished than what they would see anywhere else. Interestingly, when he published his first book of short stories, Flappers and Philosophers, which just celebrated its 100th birthday in September, he included the Ice Palace in that, but he waited on the Jelly Bean, and he included that in a book of stories called Tales of the Jazz Age, which didn't come out till 1922. He was never really necessarily fond of this story. I think he probably felt it was a little too formulaic. But it's an important story because it dramatizes that Fitzgerald could write commercial fiction with a downbeat ending. The Ice Palace does not end with the couple getting married and staying in love forever. Sally Carrol comes back home to Tarleton, but it's a comedy and it's played for laughs at the end. This story is a much sadder one, and in that regard, it looks forward to The Great Gatsby and a lot of stories that Fitzgerald wrote about young men who basically failed to win over the more affluent belle or flapper in their lives. The Jelly Bean was a derogatory term for a young, working class male in the South at the time. And the story also takes some pot shots at the South as being sort of a lazy area, sort of full of idlers. But I think where the wider audience would identify with it was it's also a story that's set at a version of the Montgomery Country Club where Scott and Zelda, according to legend, met. It's what the country club would have looked like in 1918. And it sold young readers on the idea of a sense of exclusivity. No matter where they lived, they could be part of a chic crowd that would come to these dances that would, even though it was prohibition, that would sneak alcohol or could have fun gambling. And this is what the inside of the country club looked at the time. I have to say, this is not my vision of a country club. It looks more like a hunting lodge, but they would have had dances and bands here at the time. And if you happen to see a few years ago, Amazon Prime did a TV show called Z, The Beginning of Everything. It was based on a novelized version by, oh gosh, her first name is escaping me. And I feel awful because she's a friend of mine, but it's a great book, but it only lasted one season. But I was very fortunate that the people who were making it, the filmmakers, the showrunners, invited a couple Fitzgerald friends and I to come to Savannah where they were filming it. They did not film it in Montgomery, unfortunately, because Montgomery has not preserved a lot of its historic homes. And also, we don't have the tax breaks that Georgia had. Georgia is the Hollywood of the South, as many of you might know. But interestingly enough, we got to be there on the day that they filmed this scene that was supposed to be Oakwood Cemetery. It was much flatter than Oakwood. But they did kick us off the set when they started filming the sex scene. So we only got to see them kiss as far as it went. But it was a fun little adventure to see this movie or to see parts of this TV show being filmed. There was one moment where they were filming in a house and Christina Ricci walked by and I kind of locked eyes with her and I'm sure she wondered who the hell I was, but I didn't jump up and interview her about Zelda or anything. But it was a fun little moment. Unfortunately, I mentioned that Montgomery doesn't preserve these historic structures. That country club burnt down and it moved sort of kitty corner across the street. So when I bring folks to Montgomery, this is the exact spot where Scott and Zelda met. It is now a Sonic hamburger stand. So, so much for living history here. It takes a lot of the bloom off the nostalgia to have to show folks this, but that's progress, I guess, for us. The final and best of the three stories is called The Last of the Bells. The first two came out in 1920, and they are, they have a youthful energy to them. You can tell that they are written by a 23-year-old, not because they're necessarily immature. I think they were unfortunately stereotyped that way because of Fitzgerald's early fame. But they have an energy to them, a sort of, I think, a romantic vivacity that you have to be in your 20s to really believe that you possessed. Fitzgerald toyed with the idea of writing more Tarleton stories, and in the end, he just didn't do it. I think he was afraid of being stereotyped as a writer of short story series. So it was 9 years before he came back to writing about Tarleton, and he did so in a short story called The Last of the Bells, and it's a beautiful piece. It's about a man who comes back to Tarleton, a northerner who comes back 15 years after the war, and he comes back to visit the young lady that he was not really in love with. He was one of her beaux who pursued her, but he's more enamored with what she represented to the young men of his generation. So the story sort of comes back to Fitzgerald's early years, and he's exploring to himself what maybe the appeal of Zelda was to all the young officers that were there at Camp Sheridan at the time. In a lot of ways, I like to think of this as about a story less a romance and a story about adult men and women who maybe question whether they would be happier if they were in a relationship together. And the narrator, whose name is Andy, and the young woman whose name is Allie, they realize that they just aren't made for each other. And so it has that element of the young man being thrown over again. But it ends with them driving out to the site where Camp Sheridan stood. And if you come to Montgomery and you want to see what's left of Camp Sheridan, this is it right here. All that remains of that camp that once housed 40,000 people is a marker and a few pieces of artillery. The camp was disassembled right after the war. So everything was gone by 1919. And Montgomery, in many ways, went back to being a very provincial, small southern town, all the way up until the Montgomery bus boycotts of 1955, when it became a very important site of civil rights, as we'll see. So when I read or talk about Last of the Bells to tourists in Montgomery, I like to bring them out here and say you can picture Fitzgerald coming out here in his mid-30s and realizing that a lot of the his meaningful connection to the war, but also to this coming of age experience in this town, is all gone. Last of the Bells was a Saturday Evening Post short story too, and it fits in with a lot of the again very downbeat stories he wrote for them. And I always like to remind people that we have an image of popular fiction as maybe selling romance, and while a lot of the stories that he wrote were love stories, many of them, and I would say probably 70% of them, end on a very somber and sad note. He was just so good at writing writing sadness, and I think that's part of his enduring appeal. Montgomery is an interesting city to deal with in terms of the Fitzgerald legacy. When I first came to town in 1993 to take a job teaching for Troy, I had no idea that I would sort of end up helping run a Fitzgerald Society or volunteer or have the professional opportunities I've had doing a few books here and there, and helping publish a review about Fitzgerald. But I immediately fell in love with the history of the city, very conflicted history. My office in Montgomery is just up the street from the State House, and that is the site where on February 18th, 1861, Jefferson Davis was installed as the president of the Confederacy. So Montgomery was the first capital of the Confederacy, and it's long been publicized. I mean, the Civil War no sooner ended than Montgomery tourism kind of kicked into gear, selling itself as the cradle of the Confederacy. The capital was moved up to Richmond by July of that year, so it was only the capital for about 6 months, and it was done so because Montgomery just didn't have the facilities to sort of keep a lot of the senators and legislature comfortable. It was also miserably hot in Montgomery. Not that Richmond is much better in the summer, but Montgomery is really sweltering in the thick of the South. It's a very difficult thing, as you can imagine, in this day and age to talk about the Confederate history in Montgomery, although it is certainly a part of history we can't deny. The terms of it have really shifted a lot in the past 25 years that I've been here. I'm young enough that when I first moved to town, you sort of picked between the two. You were either Confederate history, or you were into civil rights history, and that distinction always bothered me. I think more recently, the state has and the city have made a concerted effort to not to reconcile the two, but to understand that the two have to coexist. Although we're still negotiating the terms by which we acknowledge Confederate history, but we do not appear to celebrate Confederate history, if that makes sense. Montgomery was a huge center for the slave trade. And in fact, in 1850, it was a bigger slave market than either Charleston and New Orleans. And actually, if you remember back in 2008, the company that sparked the first Great Recession that we have now lived through, first Great Depression, was Lehman Brothers, which collapsed in September 2008. It got its start here in Montgomery in this circle where the slaves were bought and sold. And when I first moved again to town, there was very little acknowledgement of the history of slavery. Confederate history was celebrated really as a mark of Southern pride. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so, largely under the pressure of largely under the pressure of advocacy groups that have challenged the city to acknowledge its history. Today, this is what the former slave market looks like. This was done in June, not too long after the George Floyd murder in Minnesota sparked protest. You can see down at the end, this very same state capitol where Jefferson Davis was installed as president. What you can't see is on the right, where that little building juts out just a little bit, just behind it is Martin Luther King's church, the Baptist church where he preached in the 1950s. So you just think about the history that has taken place on this street. Zelda would have roller skated up and down this street with Tallulah Bankhead, who was a childhood friend of hers. Also another writer named Sarah Hart, who went on to marry the writer H.L. Mencken. Very ironic. H.L. Mencken is largely remembered in the South today for writing a screed called the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, which basically says the South is a cultural wasteland. So it's interesting that he would go on to marry a Montgomery young woman. But Montgomery is acknowledging its history in many exciting ways, and it's I've grown up in Montgomery a lot. I think I was maybe 26 or 27 when I first arrived. So I've seen it change quite a bit. And today we are all about acknowledging the African American presence in the city. As I mentioned, Montgomery was the birthplace of the civil rights. This was my office at Troy University. Looks out on the corner where Rosa Parks got on the bus. 20 years ago, Troy University built the Rosa Parks Museum that is one of the major tourist sites in downtown Montgomery. So it was always a point of pride for me for the 23 years I was in Montgomery. I'm a little further away now, but I still live in Montgomery and I still have an office up there. Um, uh, but the Selma to Montgomery March also culminated here, ending at the State House, as you've seen. The late John Lewis, who actually grew up in this city, Troy, Alabama, where I am now, of course, has a lot of history to Montgomery as well. And if you get a chance to read John Meacham's forthcoming book, which I believe is called The Boy from Troy, if I'm not mistaken, it will have a lot of history about John Lewis's relationship with Troy University. His initial goal was to enroll here at Troy, and of course, in the late 1950s and early 60s, that was not going to happen. So he went up and he got his education at a historically Black institution in Nashville, but he is, he and Troy made up in the 1970s, and of course he's been a treasured presence off and on. His memorial service started on our campus, so it's something to be very proud of. When I talk about friends I grew up in Michigan with about teaching in Alabama, if I usually tell them Troy University, they usually heard about it because of the John Lewis connection. I mentioned that Scott and Zelda would have spent a great deal of their romance together on 6 Pleasant Avenue. And this is what the city looks like now. This is Pleasant Avenue, this diagonal in the sort of this lower center corner of this map. Just above it is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and that opened in April 2018. It's just about 2.5 years old. But I would mention that this is more popularly known as the Lynching Memorial, and it's just a phenomenally moving sight. If you have ever seen the movie Just Mercy, or a lot of schools teach that book now, or if you've ever heard of Brian Stevenson, he opened this, his group, the Equal Justice Initiative, which is centered in Montgomery, opened this memorial. And it is just such a powerful, moving experience to come here. Essentially, you walk through a series of steel columns on which are engraved all of the names of the lynching victims in the United States, from the beginnings of slavery on up through the most recent ones, I think, are in the late 1940s. But you can't help but be moved in here. One of the things that I do is I bring classes to it, and we go around and we look up the names of the real life lynching victims who might have inspired works by William Faulkner, or who may have inspired To Kill a Mockingbird, Tom Robinson, in that novel that is set in Monroeville, Alabama. So it's a great teaching tool, and students are always very moved to go through this and to really grapple with and understand what this violence, this racial violence that we have such a tragic history of in the United States means. So it's very personally important to me that that my office in Montgomery is with, I can step out my back door and look up into this hill and basically see, I can't see this statue here because there's a fence around it, but I can see the roof of the memorial. But what's interesting is the back of the memorial backs up to 6 Pleasant Avenue, and there is nothing in the memorial about Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. There should not be, because they were frankly on the wrong side of the racial question. Other writers of their generation, such as Dorothy Parker, who you may have heard the story about how she willed her ashes to the NAACP in 1967, and it's just now finding a home because that group is relocating. And even Faulkner was more conflicted, I think, about the question of the racial question and the shadow across the promised land than Scott and Zelda were. Zelda was simply a product of her time. She, those worlds were widely segregated. Fitzgerald himself identified with the Confederacy because his father from Maryland, snuck into Confederate camps as a child. So he always associated the Confederacy with a sort of lost chivalric ideal in America. If you read these stories, I love them, and they're wonderfully humorous and sad, poignant, but they also do have racial issues in them, and African Americans are either symbols of they're either decoration in the pictorial South, or they're referred to by the N-word, and it's very difficult to sort of sell these stories in this day and age with that sort of language in it. What I try to do is talk to people about the way that Scott and Zelda's history unfolded amidst a much darker story of race in Montgomery, which they were privileged not to have to acknowledge. And so in the same months that Scott was selling his novel to Charles Scribner's son and racing down to Montgomery from New York City to beg Zelda to marry him, there was a series of lynchings in Montgomery over the course of one weekend at the end of September 1919. 3 young men were lynched in 2 separate incidents. And this is a picture of Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and the museum that is that also runs here in Montgomery, the history of slavery, has dirt from the sites where all victims were lynched. And that is him holding a jar that is from one of the men's, one of these 3. One of the things I talk about in my introduction is the story of these men, because I think it's important to acknowledge this history and to recognize that so much of the Scott and Zelda story, the romance of it, unfolds against a backdrop that's very different than what you see in their works. 1919, the summer of 1919 was a very violent summer throughout America. There were all kinds of acts of racial terrorism visited on Black communities across the country. And that's why James Weldon Johnson named it Red Summer. You may have heard in the news that just yesterday, I believe they found some of the bodies in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That incident, sometimes called a race riot, erroneously, I believe it was a racial attack on the Black community of Tulsa, Oklahoma. That inspired a recent HBO show called The Watchmen, which is a superhero show, oddly enough, but that show wonderfully goes into the legacy of Red Summer, and I encourage you, even if you're not into superheroes, to give it a visit. It too is a wonderful teaching tool that it just connects with young people in a way that I think that straightforward love stories sort of like these that I'm trying to get people interested in don't necessarily. So it's a very conflicted history. I find myself very conflicted about it. And one thing as I try to argue in the introduction is we can't really resolve it. We can't sort of, we have to live within the friction. And to me, nothing better symbolizes the friction of these 2 histories of white romance and Black tragedy than the fact that Pleasant Avenue is perpendicular to the back of the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. When you come out of the lynching memorial, the first thing you see is this quote from Toni Morrison. As I try to tell my literature students, this is not from her Nobel Prize speech in 1993. This is not from an essay that she would have written. This is from the novel Beloved. And I try to tell my students that at the same time that we're acknowledging this racial history, we also want to celebrate the power of the literature, which I think tends to get overlooked in an age of journalism, in an age of in an age of speech and oratory. I was teaching to students just before we logged on here a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks that's about ready to celebrate its 50th anniversary, called In Montgomery, where she came to Montgomery. She was hired by Ebony magazine, and Gwendolyn Brooks was the first Black person to win a Pulitzer Prize. So they teamed her up with the first Black man to win a Pulitzer Prize, one for a shot of Coretta Scott King at Martin Luther King's funeral, and to come in, and she was hired to write what she called verse journalism. She wrote a poem about a long poem about coming to Montgomery. And as I was telling my students, imagine today if we had the greatest writers alive today writing poetry about what we're going through now. I honestly can't imagine it, because we're so taken with nonfiction. So I love this quote. I love the fact that it's literature. To me, it demonstrates that that literature still has a place in this day and age. And I also take students just past this, and we peek out over the window, and we can look at the lot where Scott and Zelda's, where the house at 6 Pleasant Avenue once stood. So that's the end of my spiel. I'll start sharing my screen there, and I would, we've got just a few minutes. I would love to answer any questions that y'all might have about Scott and Zelda. As I mentioned, most folks who know anything about the Fitzgeralds probably are most familiar with The Great Gatsby. And of course, most of that takes place up in New York, Long Island, although we tend to forget that it does have a Southern element too. He just transposed it from Montgomery up to Louisville, Kentucky. Anybody have any questions? If you want to jump in, if you just want to, if you just would like to zap me a question, I'd be happy to. If you're interested in the, again, in those links to webinars, they're very lively conversations. I promise you, we have a lot of fun going over the history. As I try to tell people, we are very aware that it's important when we talk about literature to try not to be boring. So that's why I wore this loud Elton John jacket to try to wake people up. Anybody have any questions? Well, thank you. I appreciate the very kind comments. It's wonderful to be able to beam in. I really wish I could be there in person. It's a lot more fun to meet people face to face. If there are no questions, I think we are right at an hour. Let me check the chat room just real quick. And let's see. Oh, what was Zelda like? Okay. Well, that's, there's a reputation to Zelda. Zelda, I think, it's interesting because, one of the things that we sometimes get a little cornered into doing is the Fitzgerald Society is identifying either with Team Scott or Team Zelda. And in fact, one time years ago, we made up T-shirts with Team Scott and Team Zelda, and we kind of decided we would probably better not do that. But Zelda was a immensely talented dancer, painter. She was a very gifted writer on her own. Her stories are much denser and not commercial. She was much more experimental writer. But she was a very vivacious person. And later in life, I think she is unfairly stereotyped by her mental illness, which began to afflict her right as she turned 30. So she did spend the larger part of her, years from 1930 on. So it's very tragic, but she was a very funny person by all accounts. And I would just say she was gifted. I think there's some feeling that she never quite found the medium in which she could really achieve her talents in the way that her husband did in writing. But you know, I encourage you to think about their relationship not as a tragedy, but as a romance that went through a lot of different stages. And at the end, it's important to note that even though they did not live together at the end of his life, in December we'll celebrate the 80th anniversary of his death at the age of 44, that they never divorced. And he took care of her financially all the way up until his passing. Great. Wonderful. It looks like there's a question about the link for the session. I think we're going to, I will email folks here links for to the webinars, but if you just want to take down the address, GatsbyNCT.com, that is the website of the Great Gatsby in Connecticut documentary, and the webinars are all loaded onto that site. So I will send those on over after we finish up. I should mention as well that Fitzgerald Society does have a very active Facebook page and Twitter. So if you would like to learn more about what goes on Fitzgerald Society, you can find us on Facebook. We've got a group there.
Yeah, I'll just jump into, I'm going to post the link to this recording in the next couple of days, and I'll email everybody who registered for this, the recording of this. And we are having, I think his name is Richard Webb, who did Gatsby in Connecticut. He's actually doing a talk next month with us. So
good. Well, I encourage you to tune in to Deej. Deej is a great guy, and I encourage you to watch the documentary. He has a companion coffee table book to the documentary that's a lot of fun. But the thing I love about their documentary is it's just two guys with a passion for local history that set out on this adventure. And Deej is a wonderful guy, very vivacious. So you'll love that.
excellent.
Great.
All right, so we're just about at 7 o'clock. So if nobody else has any questions, I guess we can wrap it up.
Well, thank you for having me. I wish I were there. I would take everybody out for a pizza and a beer right now. Just have to
miss the place.
Pretend we're all together to do that.
Yeah.
So thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.